Hey guys, this is Akshay Sura. Today we'll be looking at Azure Functions. Azure Functions are just something I started working on recently, and I'm just basically amazed at how much work you can do nowadays on using Azure Functions on Azure. The infrastructure is great. I remember back in the day when Azure started, uh, I wasn't too impressed with it compared to AWS at that time, but Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So over the years, they've constantly improved, they've added more functionality, and it's just purely amazing. Like, all technologies, you go through periods of frustration, but most of it comes with the lack of knowledge. And this Azure Function stuff is fairly well documented on Microsoft itself. So, in the odd case of you running into an issue where you're stuck, you find the occasional blog which resolves that issue. So, again, props to Microsoft for sure. So Azure Functions, they're interesting in the way you can build them. You just quickly went through a couple of different scenarios where you can chain them together. You base it, or basically they're based on events. So if something falls in a queue, you can trigger an Azure function. An HTTP request could trigger an Azure function. Schedule tasks, several other ways of triggering these Azure functions. Each is a small piece of code, and you want to keep it typically small. So imagine, if you're having a recursion of 1,000 items, you don't want to write the code for the 1,000 items processing in one piece of code. You split it up into maybe like a loop iterating through, and then the actual functionality, which is common for all those 1,000 items in different pieces of functions, right? Just same exact way you try to put messages in the queue with the proper message that triggers a function. You do a piece of work, and the piece of work is tiny. It just gets done, and then you don't have to worry about it. And again, we on Zip Comply, we run probably Azure Functions a good 30 to 50,000 times a day with the current traffic we have, and we have no issues at this moment in time. Our daily infrastructure cost is about less than $7. So this is just purely amazing. This is also like a startup's dream, to be honest. We were thinking about how exactly do we build something serverless, which works, which scales, and traditional ways of using .NET to come up with an ASP.NET MVC application doing the same exact thing would cost a lot more to host, to be very honest. So we're really happy. There's different consumption plans for Azure Functions and Azure stuff in general, but depending on your needs, you subscribe to what fits your situation the best. Documentation, like I mentioned, fairly well documented on docs.microsoft.com. Really rarely do you have to go into different areas other than the documentation website to find more things. So let's talk about triggers. So triggers, by definition, are something which they trigger and they run a piece of functionality. Every trigger has a bit of data associated with it, so the payload contains information on what exactly you need to do, either save this specific thing in a queue, or this is the trigger where the queue just fired, this is the message. So different ways of using triggers. Bindings, there's input-output bindings. They let you bind resources to what you're trying to call at this moment in time. So for instance, a queue is something you would bind in order for you to get the message out of the queue. If you're using table storage, you would probably want to have a binding to be able to store in the table storage. For HTTP trigger, it's a different binding. So based on the bindings you require, it's just a different way of thinking in terms of how exactly you want to structure it. Once you get into it, you start realizing, oh my gosh, if you're someone new to Azure Functions, you figure out that you could break it out into different ways. There's no one answer to every situation, right? So for zip comply, we have a gazillion queues triggering things and putting it inside messages inside other queues, and we have a lot of HTTP secure endpoints pulling in data from all these consent websites. Again, development is fairly simple. Once you get into it, it's all .NET Core based. I use C# for it. You can use Python or PowerShell. It's totally up to you. .NET Core is based on 3.1 for the Azure Functions 3. We have a couple which are based on Node, which run off of a Linux container in Docker, because we use Puppeteer and Chromium in order to pull a lot of information about a website. Just today, I saw a note on Twitter that it's now part of the Linux-based functions on Azure, which is amazing. So that even the tiny bit of cost for us having a Docker container with Debian running on it is something which we can get rid of with this new version. And it's constantly new things coming up, new abilities inside of Azure Functions. So I cannot sing enough praises about Azure Functions. So next we'll take a look at how to build an Azure function. We'll build your first Azure function. It's super easy. You don't even need an Azure subscription to locally run it and test it. Of course, not all types of binding, but binding such as an HTTP binding is something really easy. HTTP function as well as a queue-based functions are really easy to run locally to test out. I just use Azure Storage Explorer locally, make sure it's set up, and then you can basically run your application. So let's take a look at that. So make sure you have the C# extension enabled on your Visual Studio Code, and also your Azure Functions extension. Once those two are installed, we can go ahead and hit the Azure Functions icon on the left, create a new project, select a folder, and here select the language, which is C#, followed by what type, which is HTTP trigger. We'll give it a name, and then select the namespace, select that it's anonymous, and add it to the workspace. So once you have that, you're pretty much set. At this point, press F5. It might give you some notifications to install some CLI stuff, but just make sure that your set location is not set on your Windows terminal or your PowerShell, because if that's in your profile, then you'll run into issues. So once you run it, it's fairly straightforward. Similar to Visual Studio, you'll get a URL which is based off of localhost port. If you run this in another browser, which I'm doing in my other monitor, and you'll see output here where it's actually executing that function. Let me bring that window in here, and I'll re-execute it again, and you can see that it's actually processing that request. So there you go. That's your first Azure function. Thanks again for joining us. Follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can reach us using the common social channels. We hope to bring you more informative videos shortly as we are ramping up and producing a lot more of these videos. So I hope you enjoyed it.